The air was thick with smoke and tension as the lights flickered in the dimly lit back room of the East Side Club. Bumpy Johnson sat at the head of the table, his hands folded in front of him, eyes cold and steady, scanning the faces of the men around him. They were the elite of the underworld, the ones who controlled the flow of money, power, and influence across the city. They were the ones who thought they could dictate the rules. But tonight, they had made one mistake too many. Across the table sat Tommy Gambino, the eldest son of one of the most powerful Mafia families in New York, the Gambino family. Tommy's eyes gleamed with arrogance, his expensive suit a sign of the wealth and power he held. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with contempt. "You've been living large in Harlem for a long time, Bumpy, but things are changing. We're running this town now, and you—" Tommy's voice faltered for a moment before he regained his bravado. "You're not in charge anymore. You'll either step aside, or we'll show you just how small Harlem really is." The words hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in venom. The room fell silent, every man at the table aware that this wasn't just a business meeting, it was a declaration of war. And Bumpy Johnson, the man who ruled Harlem with an iron fist, was the target. But as Tommy spoke, Bumpy's face remained unreadable. There was no panic, no hesitation. He knew exactly what was at stake. He had survived worse. But this time, this was personal. For Tommy Gambino, this was just another power play, a way to extend his family's dominance. For Bumpy, this wasn't just about his empire, this was about respect. It always had been. Bumpy stood up slowly, his figure towering over the table. He looked down at Tommy, his voice calm, yet laced with authority. "You think you can just walk into my city and make threats?" His voice carried through the room, cutting through the tension. "Let me remind you, Tommy, that you don't own Harlem. And you never will." The room held its breath. The power shift was undeniable. The Mafia had just made the worst decision of their lives. Bumpy Johnson wasn't born a king, but by 1927 he had become Harlem's undisputed ruler. Born in 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, he had come to New York with little more than the will to survive. The streets of Harlem had raised him, and from the moment he set foot on those streets, he understood the rules. Power wasn't given, it was taken. Respect wasn't earned through words, but through action. Bumpy's rise had been swift, carving out his empire with calculated precision and fierce loyalty. The numbers he controlled, the drug trade, the bootlegging operations, the gambling dens, were legendary. But what truly set him apart was his ability to command respect. While others sought power for its own sake, Bumpy sought something more. He sought to be feared, respected, and revered by the community he had grown up in. In Harlem, Bumpy was more than a gangster. He was a protector. He was a symbol of defiance against a world that had never given him a chance. And as the years passed, he became Harlem's true king, a man whose word was law. His name was synonymous with strength, survival, and unwavering control. But Bumpy wasn't just a figurehead in a criminal world. He had a keen mind, a sharp sense of business, and a deep understanding of the intricacies of power. He knew that to hold Harlem, He had to maintain alliances, neutralize threats, and most importantly, never show weakness. In 1927, as the city swirled with change, Bumpy had already staked his claim as the most powerful man in Harlem. The rise of organized crime families like the Gambinos only solidified his position, and while the Mafia may have been the largest criminal network in New York, Harlem was Bumpy's turf. It was a city within a city, and he controlled every corner of it. But as the Mafia began to expand its reach, tensions started to rise. Tommy Gambino and his family, known for their ruthless ambition and desire for dominance, set their sights on Harlem. They saw Bumpy as a threat to their growth, a man who could not be controlled. What they didn't understand was that Bumpy wasn't just a threat to be removed. He was a force of nature, a man who had fought tooth and nail for every inch of ground he held. And when the Mafia came knocking, Bumpy would remind them exactly why Harlem belonged to him. It wasn't long after the meeting that the Gambino family made their first move. Johnny Big Nose Santoro, a key figure in the Gambino network, began muscling into Bumpy's businesses. They targeted Bumpy's gambling joints, his liquor distribution, and even some of his more legitimate operations. They tried to squeeze the life out of his empire, pressuring local businesses to pay them protection money. The stakes were raised when Santoro, in a bold move, started threatening Bumpy's men in broad daylight. But Bumpy didn't retaliate right away. He wasn't a man of rash actions. He watched, waited, and gathered information. He knew the Gambino family was testing him, trying to break his spirit, to see if he was still as untouchable as the rumors said. What they didn't know was that Bumpy wasn't just untouchable. He was calculating. As the weeks passed, the pressure on Harlem's streets grew. Bumpy's men faced constant harassment from the Gambino's crew, and every business owner who had once relied on Bumpy's protection began to feel the heat. Word spread fast. The Gambinos were making their move, and Bumpy was weakening. But in Harlem, no one knew better than Bumpy how to keep his enemies guessing. The Gambino family was about to find out that the streets of Harlem were not theirs to take. The next move came in the form of a quiet evening at the East Side Club. Bumpy Johnson had just arrived, stepping into the smoky haze of the room with his usual unflinching demeanor. But something in the air was different tonight. His instincts told him the Gambino family was planning something big, a bold move, perhaps a confrontation to force his hand. As Bumpy sat down at his usual corner booth, he noticed a couple of familiar faces tense up in the room, exchanging furtive glances. His men were posted around the space, eyes scanning the crowd. Something wasn't right. Then the door opened, and in stepped a figure Bumpy hadn't expected. Tommy Gambino himself. Tommy was flanked by a few of his trusted enforcers, all wearing the same expression of smug certainty. They had the air of men who thought they had already won. But Bumpy didn't flinch, didn't rise to greet them. Instead, he sat still, his steely gaze locking onto Tommy's as the younger Gambino walked toward him. The tension in the room was palpable. The patrons grew silent, the sound of clinking glasses and hushed whispers suddenly drowned out by the looming confrontation. This was it. Tommy had come to settle things once and for all. Tommy stopped in front of Bumpy's table, looking down at the man who had ruled Harlem for years. His tone was casual, but the challenge was clear. "I think we're past talking, Bumpy," Tommy said, his smile wide but hollow. You've had your time, but now it's our turn to run things. I'm here to make it easy for you. You either hand over Harlem to my family, or we make things difficult.
Bumpy didn't move an inch.
His eyes never left Tommy, but his hands rested calmly on the table, each finger carefully wrapped around the rim of his glass. He took a slow sip, a slight pause that felt like an eternity to the room around him. Then, with a deliberate slowness, he set the glass down. You still don't understand, do you, Tommy? Bumpy's voice was low but powerful, filling the silence between them like thunder rolling across the sky. You think you can just walk in and take what's mine because your name's on some family tree. But Harlem is more than just territory. It's a way of life. It's my life. And you, or any other man, can't just buy it. Tommy's smirk faltered, the mask of bravado slipping just a bit as Bumpy's words hung in the air. There was something about Bumpy's quiet confidence, his unwavering resolve, that rattled him. But Tommy wasn't ready to back down just yet. Then we do this the hard way, Tommy spat, his voice dripping with venom. You've been a thorn in my side for too long, Bumpy. Tonight, that ends. Before Bumpy could respond, Tommy nodded sharply to one of his men, signaling for them to make their move. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the eruption to follow. But just as Tommy's enforcer stepped forward, a sharp voice cut through the air. Not in here, Tommy. The voice came from the door, where one of Bumpy's most trusted lieutenants, Big Jim, had stepped into the room, flanked by several of Bumpy's men. Big Jim's massive frame blocked the doorway, and his stare was enough to make the men behind Tommy hesitate. Bumpy's men had silently surrounded the room while the tension had grown. No one moved, but everyone knew the stakes. This wasn't just a standoff, it was a test to see who would blink first. Tommy saw the odds shifting, but he was too deep into his pride to back down. He took a step forward, his eyes blazing with determination, his finger now pointing directly at Bumpy.
You think you've got it all figured out, don't you?
Tommy seethed. This isn't your city anymore. You're out of options, Bumpy. But Bumpy, for all the pressure bearing down on him, remained calm. He leaned back in his chair, his hands now resting loosely on his lap. He wasn't intimidated. He wasn't even angry. He was just in control. The silence stretched on, and in that moment, it felt as though the entire room was holding its collective breath. Bumpy's reputation was built on his ability to control these moments. The stillness before the storm, the calm before the chaos. And as Tommy stood there, his challenge hanging in the air like a threat, Bumpy simply responded, his words slow and deliberate. You don't understand. This ain't about power. It's about respect, and you don't have it. Not from me, not from Harlem. Tommy opened his mouth to retort, but Bumpy was already moving. In a flash, he stood, the force of his presence crashing into Tommy's bubble of arrogance. His eyes locked onto Tommy's with an unshakable intensity. You want Harlem? Bumpy's voice was now a low growl, filled with a quiet fury. You'll have to go through me, and trust me, Tommy, that's something you'll regret. The threat hung in the air, the entire room feeling the weight of Bumpy's words. Tommy had gone too far, and Bumpy wasn't about to let anyone, not even the most powerful family in New York, take what was his. It was a showdown waiting to happen. And it came faster than anyone expected. Tommy made a motion to reach for his pocket, signaling for his men to move in. But before he could even blink, Bumpy's men surged forward, taking control of the room in an instant. A loud crash echoed as chairs were knocked over and tables upended in the chaos. The fight erupted like a whirlwind, fists flying, the sound of boots pounding the hardwood floor reverberating through the space. But Bumpy was calm, his movements sharp and purposeful, his focus entirely on Tommy, the man who had dared to challenge him in his own domain. Tommy tried to fight back, but he wasn't prepared for the skill and speed with which Bumpy's men moved. They had been trained in the art of street combat, swift, brutal, and efficient. They weren't just protecting their boss, they were ensuring that no one would ever question Bumpy Johnson's reign again. In the midst of the chaos, Bumpy approached Tommy, his eyes cold as he grabbed the young Gambino by the collar, lifting him off the ground with ease. The room went silent once again, the fight momentarily ceasing as all eyes turned to the two men locked in confrontation. Tommy struggled, but it was no use. Bumpy's grip was ironclad. "You want to learn what respect looks like?" Bumpy growled, his face inches from Tommy's. "You'll never get it here. Not in Harlem. Not from me." With a swift motion, Bumpy threw Tommy to the ground, and his men moved in, quickly subduing the rest of the Gambino crew. The message had been sent. The Gambino family, for all their power and influence, had just been humbled by one man. The room stood in stunned silence as the last of Tommy Gambino's men were restrained. The chaos of the confrontation had died down, but its aftermath was far from over. Tommy, now face down on the floor of the East Side Club, was shaking off the shock of being so easily overpowered. His face was flushed with anger, his pride shattered into 1,000 pieces. But even as he tried to push himself up, the undeniable truth of the situation settled in. This wasn't just a defeat, it was a humiliation. Bumpy stood tall, his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. He surveyed the room with a cold, calculating gaze. No one spoke. No one dared. It wasn't just about the fight. It was about the message he had just sent. The streets of Harlem were his, and no man, no matter how powerful, would take that from him. Tommy, realizing the magnitude of his failure, finally attempted to get up. His voice trembled as he spoke, but there was no denying the desperation in it. "This isn't over, Bumpy," he spat, wiping blood from his lip. "You think you've won? You think the Gambinos will let you get away with this?" Bumpy's eyes narrowed, his expression unchanging. "You're not hearing me, Tommy. You didn't just lose a fight. You lost respect," Bumpy said, his voice a low rumble. "And when you lose respect in Harlem, you lose everything." Without another word, Bumpy signaled for his men to release the pressure they were applying to Tommy's remaining enforcers. "Let them go," he commanded, but his eyes never left Tommy. "You came here to challenge me, and now you've learned what happens when you step into my world." Tommy and his men were quickly escorted out, their heads low, their shoulders slumped in defeat. The message was clear. The Gambinos had crossed a line they should never have dared to cross. And now, the streets of Harlem would remember this day for years to come. As Tommy and his crew left the club, Bumpy remained behind, his presence still filling the room. The patrons, who had watched in silence, began to murmur among themselves, their respect for Bumpy growing with every passing second. They had witnessed the fall of one of the most powerful families in the city, and they had seen it done by a man who commanded authority not through brute force, but through unshakable resolve and an unyielding sense of justice. The Gambino family may have been the largest criminal network in New York, but in Harlem, there was only one name that mattered: Bumpy Johnson. His reign had been solidified once again, not by violence, but by his unwavering ability to protect his territory, his people, and his legacy. The events that transpired in that back room of the East Side Club marked a turning point, not just for Bumpy Johnson, but for the entire community of Harlem. It wasn't just the defeat of the Gambino family that stood out. It was the way Bumpy handled the situation. His actions that night would echo through Harlem's streets for years to come, cementing his status as more than just a gangster. He had become a symbol. The Gambino family, once confident they could take control of Harlem, retreated in disgrace. Word of their failure spread like wildfire, reaching not just the underworld, but the entire city. Bumpy's name became synonymous with strength, but also with honor. The man who had faced down the most powerful family in New York had done so with dignity, not violence. And it was that dignity that earned him the respect of not only his people, but his enemies as well. The people of Harlem had always known Bumpy Johnson as their protector, their king. But now, after the showdown with Tommy Gambino, Bumpy's legend had been solidified. No one would dare challenge him again, not the Mafia, not the police, not anyone. The streets belonged to Bumpy, and the people who lived there knew it. His legacy wasn't just built on the power he wielded, it was built on the respect he commanded. Bumpy had shown that you didn't need to bow to anyone, not even the most powerful criminal family in the city. You didn't need to fight for power, you simply needed to be the man everyone knew they could rely on. The man who never backed down and never compromised. As the years passed, the tale of Bumpy Johnson's showdown with the Gambinos would become one of the defining moments in Harlem's history. It would be passed down from one generation to the next, a story of courage, respect, and unshakable resolve. And through it all, Bumpy's legend would endure. The Gambino family had thought they could conquer Harlem. They believed their wealth, their influence, and their name would be enough to drive Bumpy Johnson out. But what they didn't understand was that Bumpy wasn't a man who could be bought or intimidated. In Harlem, respect wasn't something you could demand. It was something you earned. And Bumpy had earned it through years of loyalty, struggle, and a refusal to back down. This wasn't just about one man's pride. This was about the pride of an entire community. Bumpy Johnson didn't just fight for himself. He fought for the people who lived and worked in Harlem. He fought for their right to live without fear, to walk the streets with their heads held high. And in doing so, he reminded the world that true power doesn't come from the size of your empire. It comes from the respect you command from those around you. The Gambino family might have been the biggest criminal organization in New York, but in Harlem, there was only one king. And that king was Bumpy Johnson. His legend would live on, not in the battles he fought, but in the respect he earned. In the end, it was never about money, power, or dominance. It was about honor. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds were against you. And sometimes, it takes a legend to remind the world what true respect really means.